My name is David Stark. I'm the coordinator of the Latin American and Latina Studies program, and I teach in the history department as well as in the Honors College. I am delighted that you can join us. Before introducing our speaker, let me say a few words about our upcoming and current events. We also have a talk by Dr. Delia Fernandez on Thursday, October 29th from 3 to 4:15 p.m. Dr. Fernandez's talk is titled, "We Want a Commitment, Black, White, and Latino Demands for Community-Controlled Policing in Grand Rapids, 1965 to 1973. She is a Grand Valley graduate and now teaches at Michigan State University. Both today's talk by Dr. Edwards and the one by Dr. Fernandez are generously co-sponsored by the History Department. Thank you, Dr. Huner, for your help in making this possible. Also, for those of you interested in film, we have 2 weeks left in the 10th Grand Rapids Latin American Film Festival. This year's film festival is online, and you can access it by going to the website, GRLAFF. All films are screened on Friday and Saturday nights at 8 p.m. They are free, and you can also watch previously screened films as well. The Friday films feature an opportunity to participate in a question and answer session with the film director. This week, you can meet Ruben Mendoza, who is the director of Niña Errante that will be screened this Friday. You can meet with Ruben Mendoza at 9:45 p.m. The festival ends on October the 15th, so make sure you don't miss out on this opportunity. This talk by Dr. Edwards is special for me. She's a Grand Valley graduate who majored in history, and she's also my former student. I first met Erika, as I always refer to her, when she was a junior and expressed an interest in going on to graduate school. I worked with her in the McNair Scholars Program for 2 years and became her academic advisor as well. During that time, we became close, though I'm sure there were moments when I probably pushed her too hard. It wasn't easy for Erika as a first-generation college student, and Grand Valley's campus wasn't nearly as diverse as it is today. However, Erika never let anything stand in her way. She went on to Florida International University and graduated with a doctorate in colonial Latin American history. Erika's dissertation focused on what happened to Argentina's Afro-descended population, a topic she first studied here at Grand Valley in the McNair Scholars Program. Upon her graduation, she was hired by the University of North Carolina, Charlotte to teach colonial Latin American history as well as other interesting topics, and she is now a tenured professor. Dr. Edwards revised her dissertation, as most history professors do, and it was published this year as Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic, and it was published by the University of Alabama Press. I am very proud of Dr. Edwards' accomplishments and her perseverance over the years in making the dream of becoming a history professor a reality. Her research is cutting edge, and you are all in for a treat as Dr. Edwards talks to us about Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women and the Making of a White Nation. But before we get started, I ask that you write any questions for Dr. Edwards about the talk in the chat, and afterwards I will ask the question. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Erika Denise Edwards.
Oh, I can imagine here. Oh, there we go. There's a few. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Stark. first and foremost, I want to thank Grand Valley. I want to thank the Latina Studies program, the history department for hosting me. It feels good to be home. It's actually a little bit nerve-wracking because some of you are my former professors. So, you know, it's always feel like you want to do your best. But like I said, it feels great to be home and to present this research, which began, as Dr. Stark mentioned, at Grand Valley. And it's one of those things where so many things came together at once and kind of put me on this path to graduate school. And it was a opportunity. I also have to thank the Padnos Scholarship and the Padnos, I think it's still called the Barbara Padnos Center for International Studies. I received a scholarship from them, and that is what allowed me to go to Argentina during that semester and come back questioning where exactly were the Black people. Which then, as Dr. Stark said, I went ahead and worked with him for the next 2 years, publishing 2 papers, which I am happy to say are actually cited still by some scholars. So you just never know what your research can do. And then from there, I continued with that question that hopefully, and I believe I've done it satisfactorily, answered this question of what happened to the Black population in Argentina. So with that, I just kind of want to move forward to explain a little bit about how I even got to studying Cordoba, studying Black women, as I think that's important that we also kind of get that context. So let me get this going. The first slide, as you see, is myself. After returning back from, and this was in 2001 when I was still a junior at Grand Valley, that I came, or 2002, I came back, I was excited, I was ready, published those 2 papers, graduated, and then 4 years later, I am back into the archives in 2008 on a Fulbright, and that's me actually working on then my dissertation, a dissertation that ultimately argued and showed how visible and active the Black population was in Argentina. But it wasn't until 2014, now I'm a professor and I'm still working on putting together my making my dissertation into a book, that I really said, okay, something has to give. And it wasn't until this moment, 2014, if you follow soccer, it was Argentina versus Germany in the final. And the blogs went nuts, Huffington Post went nuts, Henry Louis Gage Jr. wrote his op-eds with the question of where are the Black players? Okay, all of these South American teams had Black players. Their opponents, Germany, had a Black player. So how is it possible that Argentina does not have one Black player? So again, the question of disappearance and Black erasure then became a popular theme. And I said, okay, I guess I'm going to go from showing that they exist to actually really answering that question, and that's what I did in my book. And also, I think to be fair, it's a good question, because what we find as scholars is, as you can see, census data from 1778. That's the first year that they took census data in the Rio de la Plata, which is Argentina today. 30% of, in general, 30% of the entire area was of African descent, meaning that they were labeled as negros, mulattos, free, or enslaved. Okay, so you've got a sizable and visible population, which is something I showed in my dissertation. But then 2010, right? This is the last census. This year they're doing the next census, but this is the most complete that we have. And this is also the first time in over 100 years that they even put the question up there of if you are even an Afro-descendant. What came back was less than 1%. So to be fair, right, if you go to Argentina, most likely you would also get the impression that there just are no Black people. And so that's what shifted me back to, okay, I was interested in this. I thought I said something in the dissertation, but now I'm really going to hit home with that answer in the monograph. And I decided to shift it then in two ways. One way was to talk about Cordoba, Argentina. And this is ultimately one of the main reasons why I did that, is because we find that most scholarship in general about Argentina is always about the capital. And I just felt that at a certain point, there should be more to be said about the actual country. And in doing so, we may be able to get a little more of a complex understanding of what happened to the Black population. Another reason why I chose Cordoba is, you can see here, and this is the top in the corner of your screen, this is a map of the city, the first map that was drawn in 1577. What makes Cordoba so unique is that essentially that city stayed the same until about the 1870s. So you're looking at about 300 years of a very small, quaint city, where I believe the most that existed until about the 1860s, 1870s was 13,000 people. So that made my research even more interesting, because then I was able to find my characters in various archives and various sources. It would constantly repeat because it was so small. So I said, I want to do Cordoba. It's an antithesis of Buenos Aires, which especially during the 19th century was this booming, liberal, metropolitan city, and Cordoba remained very traditional, very Catholic. And so I said, let me see what's going on in terms of understanding what happened to their Black population. And so I also want to note the other two photos that I have. One is of the cathedral, and then the other one down here is the Cabildo, or the town hall. Both of those are parts of them are still from the originals that existed, that were built, in 1577, which I know it's a little bit hard to see, but they would have been right here. Okay, and they're still right here. Of course, the city has expanded. Another really cool aspect is that the archive was roughly about 4 or 5 blocks away from this original area, the plaza, the Plaza Major, the main plaza. And so when I was there during for the photo that you just saw, I would literally get out of the archive and go and sit in that original plaza that still exists today in Cordoba. So you can really feel, especially in the downtown area, that colonial culture is thriving. Very much so. And I think at times it also helped me to just kind of really imagine what it would have been like to walk those streets on a daily basis. So with that, for the rest of the presentation, I just want to walk you through vis-a-vis vignettes or stories that I used in my book to ultimately talk about her and why I chose her and what she ultimately shows us from this transition of Black to white. So here, actually, I have to first and foremost give a little bit of a shout out. The entire title is Argentina, Land of Vanishing Blacks. It was written in 1973, and it was written by Ebony Magazine. And they are actually the first, at least within the US context, to take hold of this question and say what happened to them. And as you can see, this is a picture of their, of a family of sisters. And so I love that spread in which it shows the various levels of Blackness. You have chocolate, you have caramel, you have vanilla phenotypes, all within one family, as then they went on to discuss the present situation, what was happening in the 1970s. I also use this in to again stress why I chose Black women. I chose Black women mainly because I found that, if there was a lot, what was written was oftentimes focused on Black men and their experiences during the wars and or their experiences as citizens of a nation. But I said, well, where is she? She clearly was there, right? And that's really what got me thinking over and over again as I went through my sources and I found her, that she was constantly hidden in plain sight. So one of the things I recognized, first and foremost, she was not a victim, as some of these myths of disappearance, these lies of disappearance continue to perpetuate, but rather she was very strategic in how she moved and ultimately made decisions that were used to socially ascend for herself and or when she couldn't at times, her children. Okay. And the other important thing I found when I focused on her was the household and how important the household was in this creation of a white nation. And so what she provides is almost a lens into what we would say the private sphere of power dynamics that are happening oftentimes within the house that are not meant to be seen by others. Oftentimes these various intimate acts, whether they're because of amorous relationships or vulnerability, I want to stress, those are where she was able to maneuver and make moves in order to socially ascend. So those are the reasons what I found in my evidence to move forward with her. So looking at then the various roles that she played, one being concubines, wives, mothers, and daughters, each one played a role then in moving the nation, what would become the nation, into a very white nation. So the first one is concubines, which I found a really great case in which a concubine started out as a slave, but towards the end of their love affair was noted as being, or at least she demanded that she be called a señora, which is another way to say that she demanded that people acknowledge that she had the same privilege and status as other Spanish or white women. Her name was Bernabella Villamante. And she ended up, the whole chapter really is dedicated to her, but she ended up in a love affair with a priest, which clearly is a no-no. But what made it even more egregious is that he not only supported it, but was very public about their affair. And so he actually helped her with their transition to becoming the señora. In the fact that he helped her break what are known as sumptuary laws. There were laws on the books that specifically said that women of African descent could not wear silk, could not wear gold, could not wear various types of jewelry because they were of a lower status. But the problem was not so much that she broke that rule, but the bigger issue is she was the color, as it says, of a Spanish woman. So her ability, and of course his support of it, to not only dress her like that, also allowed for her to transition and transcend and emulate successfully a señora. And if it wasn't for the fact that they eventually got caught, she would have been able to transition all the way, especially because they kept running away to different towns and trying to start a new life. What she did do, however, was she was able to get her daughter, which from what I could read is from a previous relationship, got her baptized and noted to be baptized in the Book of Spanish Baptisms. That's important because the church divided the society from the Spanish and everybody else in their books, okay? So that ultimately allowed her daughter, Gregoria, to ultimately, if there was any cast of doubt of what she was, here are my papers, right? I am officially a Spanish woman, okay? So that's one of the ways in which these African descended women could break the law in order to socially ascend. There are also ways in which they worked within the law, and that would be vis-a-vis wives, right? As wives, and specifically a woman of his class, which is what one of the court cases showed. So to give some context, by the end of the 18th century, there was a law that came forward that ultimately argued that unequal marriages had to have their approval from their parents. So, for example, if you are under the age of 25 and your parents did not, and you apparently married someone your parents did not like, they could tell you, no, you could not get married. Okay? This was a larger, within the larger context of social control and surveillance that was coming down hard, because it was during the middle of a very chaotic period where there's a lot of revolutions happening. So they're trying to clamp down on anything that can cause any type of chaos. So what we find then is that apparently a lot of parents told their children no. But this same law also said if the couple found that their reasons for getting married is just, they could then take their parents to court. And that's what I ended up looking at, are those court cases. Very juicy stuff. So one of the things that I looked at are then these cases in which women were accused of being Black, okay? Now, to what extent they were or not, I'm not sure, but I just looked at when they were accused of having what's called mala sangre, or tainted blood, and then their suitor, their husband-to-be was oftentimes white. So his parents were very upset that she would be part of the family. So he said, no, I'm going to take him to task. I'm going to take him to court. And what I found, which was so interesting in this case, yes, there were plenty of cases in which we saw them argue, no, I am not Black, I'm actually white, show various levels of a genealogy, bring forth witnesses. But for Cordoba, I think what made it very unique is that, especially in the case of Manuela Arrieta, is that not only did they argue that they were white, at times they even argued that they were Indian. And so that's important for us to recognize what they call the interior, anything outside of Buenos Aires, and that back and forth connection with Black and Indigenous peoples even back then, okay? Because within that same law, it gave an exception to Indigenous peoples who were considered to be honorary Spaniards. So we find then that we have these women that would find a way to argue, as in the case of her, that she was a descendant of noble Indians, right? So I thought that was very cool to be able to show then what we mean by becoming, the whitening process was not always directly Black to white. It could be a bit of a browning process too, okay? So that was, again, I of course found cases in which she argued and found a way to become Spanish, but then they also found a way to become Indian. Once they became married, this was, and I kept finding this over and over again. Sometimes they would start out as a slave, and an example of this would have been Teresa Soledo, another person who started out, was born a slave, got married, became a mestiza or an indigenous person, and then they moved to another small town, and by the time she died in 1811, she was listed as a doña. So she also found a way to move up slowly but surely to the coveted position of being a señora, a Spanish woman. Then as mothers, okay, and engendering the freedom process. This is important, especially as we look at now this transition from colonial to the Republican period. What I found, which was so interesting, is that Cordoba, being more of a conservative and traditional city, did not use the same rhetoric as we find in Buenos Aires. Instead, it was various ways in which these women could manipulate and use colonial law, even as they transitioned to an independent nation, in order to become a more, how can I put this? In order to become a more free society, okay? Because in general, what we find is that the entire Rio de la Plata, as it's moving through this independence period, it is becoming a freer society. But again, within Cordoba, what they use are colonial tactics to get there. So in this case, I have a woman named Maria Guerra who whose case started actually in 1808 but ended in 1817, and she came forward because as she argued, her patron had died. A man that she had served for years had died, and so she was at risk of being enslaved again because his sons and daughters were coming to claim her. And their claim was that she's a slave. We want her, we want to sell her. It's the independence period. We have to move forward. I mean, everybody's broke at this point. But she said, no, that's not possible. She then produced a genealogy to show that she was Indian. This again is important because as far back as 1542, there was a law that stated that indigenous peoples could not be slaves. That did not mean that they were not treated with the same disrespect, that their lives were often at risk because of various levels of abuses. It continued. But unlike Africans and African descendants who could be enslaved, they could not. They oftentimes worked alongside each other, one free and one enslaved, okay? But that's important in terms of Maria Guerra and other people that I found in terms of getting that free status. So that is what she argued. She argued that she was a descendant of the Pampas. She argued that she wore various types of mantas and other different types of indigenous dress in order to show that she was actually Indian. She argued and showed that her sister lived in an area known as La Toma, which was where a former encomienda, or a former place where a lot of indigenous peoples lived and worked. She did all this to show again that she was and had always been free. She was just working for this particular person. In the end, she received her freedom. But again, because of colonial law, her freedom as a woman transferred also to her descendants. So if you were born free, if you were born free, that also meant that your children would be free. So just a side note, we often found enslaved Black men would seek out indigenous women just for that reason. Well, of course they love them too, but also the strategic notion that their children would be free. She receives her freedom, and then it also states because of the maternal lineage of her being indigenous, that meant not only she was free, her children were free, as well as her grandchildren were also free. But they also then become, again, part of this browning process of Argentina, which we've yet to really dive into and explaining as that being a part of Black erasure. And so lastly then, so slave to free and free Indian is what I wanted to stress. Then lastly is the daughters, right? And how daughters ultimately played a very important role in uplifting the next generation. Now we are specifically in the Republican period, but yet we still find that colonial habits die hard in Cordoba. What ends up happening is that in Cordoba, there is a school for girls that is created at the end of the 18th century. And it's meant to ultimately create ideal mothers. And so there's two different levels that are ultimately that come forth. You have those that can live on the grounds and those that have to commute. This continues for years, and then in 1811, we find that they open up another external class or commuter class just for these pardas. Pardas then, by the beginning of the 19th century, is meaning another word for everyone that isn't white. So that is significant as and shows again this movement towards just the label itself, this movement towards erasing Blackness. If no one is Black anymore, you're now Pardo, you're almost becoming an othering process, okay? So I wanna pause very quickly because what I'm showing you on the screen is the museum that exists. And so you see the kitchen, you see where some of them lived. Oftentimes those that were internal girls or those that lived on the premises, they would learn to play the organ. And then unfortunately, I'll have to, hopefully you can see it here. This is supposed to be a black and a white angel. This is the chapel that still exists today, that people still pray in today. And that was painted on there to represent the original goal of the school. The school still exists today. Their kids still go there. It's now integrated boys and girls, and it's there to serve the poor in Cordoba today. But back to what it's, and essentially it's still uplifting, as they would argue, this generation. So in my case, what I found was a woman, or I should say at this point, a girl named Bernardina in 1816 who received her manumission based on the fact that she would have to go to that school and graduate from that school. If she dropped out of that school, she would then be denied her freedom. So that is, again, very significant because what it shows us is that at least to the state and the state, the government, excuse me, as well as the church, really then were a symbiotic, had a symbiotic relationship in which they were really trying to cultivate and create an ideal, what they would call at this point, citizen. And an ideal citizen is someone who is no longer enslaved. In fact, slavery is a dying institution at this point. So the question is, well, how do we train them to be then ideal citizens and people that we can continue to control and that they know their place? Well, they found it through her. Her meaning African descended women that served as Republican mothers who would then, as they would say, go to school, learn these values, learn morality, civility, how to cook, clean, sew, and then also eliminate levels of what's called moral ignorance and teach, in their case, their sons, because they're the ones that could legally become citizens, how to be civil, moral, and obedient to the state. And so what we're finding in is that these African descended women and daughters are now in tandem with the state's goal. And that goal is ultimately part of this process of institutionalized whitening that was taking place, okay? And so those are the ways in which these various roles in which women, African descended women, played a role in the whitening process. My book then ends, and this story kind of ends in 1850, prior to a real aggressive form of whitening that will take place at the end of the 19th century, in which you'll have their leaders push forward a project of immigration, white immigration, to whitewash literally the nation, because a white nation is then considered a modern nation. But I, as I stressed before, decided to look at Cordoba, and I want to also point out an earlier time frame to show that it just that aggressive form just does not take place overnight. There is a process. And by looking then at Cordoba and looking at her particular position and role in the household, we are able then to see a unique lens and how Argentina becomes a white nation. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to kind of give you a sense of what my book is about and what my research is about. And I will entertain any questions, comments, anything. It's awkward not seeing people, but okay.
So we have a question from Darlene who says, where can we find the book?
Oh, yeah, I got to plug that every once in a while. Okay, so you can get it at, you can go online at the University of Alabama Press, And I will put in the chat, but there's a discount code that you can use to get it, to get 30% off. It's HPS30. You put that in at the end and you get 30% off, but I will put that in the chat. I will actually stop sharing now. I will put that in the chat so you have that. Thank you.
Can I ask some questions?
Sure.
I'm really curious, is race self-reported at that time? And here I'm thinking about if a couple got married, would they come out and say, I'm white, black, you know, pardo, mulatto, whatever? Or was it up to the priest or the scribe to make this decision? I mean, how was race reported?
So it's both, right? And you can look at someone who would come up, you know, you'd go, or census taker would go about and they would, you know, either note it themselves or someone could self-report. That's what makes it oftentimes a fickle situation for us as historians to really see what is happening. It could be very individual, back and forth, or they could bribe someone at times, especially for those that were looking to, put their children in the book of baptisms for Spanish people. You know, we don't know to what extent that took to make sure that they were put in that one versus the book of for castas. So it was a back and forth negotiation. So what I did in order to really get a sense of the practices that were happening is I decided to take all baptisms, marriages and death records, both those that were mainly of castas, and I traced them for 80 years. And that then allowed for me to get a general sense of the practice of them moving from negro, mulatto to then to pardo, right? All of them. So I even found, you know, some indigenous peoples that were now being labeled as pardos, but you know, they were born Indian. And then, excuse me, from there, about the 1840s, even though they're listed in the book of castas, they no longer say what their race is. So that's another form of institutionalized whitening in which we just don't talk about it anymore.
Thank you, fascinating.
Professor Stark, there's 2 questions in the chat.
Sorry.
Yeah. One's from Brenda Michner. She's asking that if you could, Professor Edwards, just go over again the significance of Cordova.
Sure.
Why choose that city? And then the next question is from Professor Murphy. He wants to know if men followed similar strategies, and were all women able to pursue the strategy of browning or whitening, given the 30% census figure in the late 18th century.
Okay, so why Cordova? In general, what I found was that most of the scholarship about Black people is really focused on Buenos Aires. So I knew, and at one point I was in the archive, and I remember one day there was 5 of us working on Black people in Buenos Aires, and I said, oh my gosh, that's enough, you know, let's move on. And so I knew I wanted to go somewhere else. Cordoba at the time was the 2nd largest city. It still is. It goes back and forth between that and Santa Fe. And so I said, okay, I want to definitely do Cordoba. And also when I went there, what solidified and said yes was the pristine level of the archives and the sources. I could not believe it. It was like I hit a pot of gold. And they're not used to having foreigners in their archives, which I thought was absolutely adorable at times. They would ask me, because they asked me, there are only 3 other Americans that had been to that archive. And they asked me if I knew them, which I knew 2 of the 3, which I guess is kind of crazy too. But, you know, so one of them being that visited the archive in 1981. They were still like, hey, do you know this guy? I'm like, no, but the other ones I did. So the sources really are the ones that made me say, yes, I want to do this. And again, what was great about the fact that during the colonial period, it stayed a small city, is that I was then able to find, for example, Bernabella in this great case that was in the ecclesiastical archives, the church archives. But then I was able to go to other archives and I found her doing other things. Like I found, for example, the baptism of her little girl. Or I found that she was originally bought and sold by another family. And so, you know, I was able to kind of see what happened to her, as well as the priest who, again, even though he had this amazing love affair with her, he continued to get in trouble. And eventually this, you know, kicks it all the way up to the king, I found out in other places. And eventually he'll get excommunicated. It's going to take a while, but yeah. So it's this ability to find things, you know, finding women that I found for a marriage descent case, for example, that didn't make it into the book, but because I thought she was a white woman who wanted to marry a black man, and her mother was mad about it. Well, now after the book is out, I'm working on something else. And I said, wait a second. Her mother was passing. I find out later on. And I'm like, oh my, that would have been a really good one for the book. But anyways, it'll be an article. But the point is that, you know, because it was so small, I could trace their lives. So that's why Cordova. As far as men following a similar suit, first of all, hi, Dr. Murphy. It's so great to, well, I was going to say see you, but I can't. But it's good to like, no, you're out there. Men following a similar suit, the answer is no. The reason why is because what we find if we think of gender and what the role that they play in the nation, they are going to play more of a public role. So this is where they will be the soldiers. This will be the ones that will be ultimately out there fighting for the nation. And that is how they use their clout, right, to show that they are worthy of various levels of citizenship. And this is important because it's only men that can be citizens. So that is what they're seeking. And so that is how they are moving forward in this whitening process. Women, all women? No, of course not all women. And so I juxtaposed some of the cases of whitening with those that were not successful. Specifically for those that, for example, phenotypically, there's no way you could pass for being a Spanish woman, for one, for example, or for the other example in which there's Black mothers that would not abide by the rules in terms of petitioning for their daughters. And so they would break the rule because they did not care. In this case, this woman was desperate, felt that this man was going to take her daughter to another city. And so rather than seeking a lawyer, a white lawyer, she went to the court herself, which they said is a no-no. And then she goes to another jurisdiction, which is another no-no. So, and in the end, it does not work in her favor. So yes, there are circumstances where African descended women cannot move to that next level. And I wanted to be responsible in telling that as well in the book.
We have another question here. Let me read it to you. Thank you for the talk. One of the most fascinating themes to come out of this is the material culture wielded by women to gain agency. For instance, you mentioned the wearing of silks and buying of certain kinds of goods. What is the legacy of those materials in the 19th to the 21st century? In the process of browning and whitening, what happens to those materials? Are new identities built around them, or do they still symbolize increased agency?
Wow.
I'm happy to repeat any of that if you need to.
Oh, no, I got it. So I want to say wow, because that is a great question. But I challenge you. I guess for myself, I have a problem with the word agency, especially now. Maybe this is in terms of understanding how they socially ascend. But I don't like to use the word agency, but that's my own personal preference. Nevertheless, do they symbolize something similar, let's say at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century? The answer is yes. And this is beyond my research, so I'm going to speak a little bit more about what's happening at the end of the 19th century in Buenos Aires, where we have the amazing sources known as the Black press. So we actually have their voices. And just to, again, reiterate, not reiterate, but return to Dr. Murphy's question, this is also where we find a lot of male voices as well in terms of what's happening. So, but anyways, one of the ways in which they showed by then, where you have more of an onslaught of the whitening process, you have white immigrants coming forward, is through their dress. And they made sure, especially for those that wanted to distance themselves from the Black community, they made sure they dressed in the most, updated or in fashion styles from Paris, for example. And they made sure that they traveled to Europe, and they made sure that people knew and understood that they were different than those Black people over there. So yes, you still see that happening as a marker of class, and also a marker in which it showed that they were, and to quote what they would call themselves, gente de usted, which means the polite you, versus gente de che, which means the informal you. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Other questions for Dr. Edwards?
Can I interject a question here, Professor Stark?
Of course, please.
And this is a fellow specialist question, right?
Okay.
And of course, this is me being a little bit unfair because I had a chance to ask last night, but my students took all the questions. They took all the air. So
They did.
Which is a good thing, right? Well, I took up some air too, so I should be honest. But anyways, more air. The term bardo or barda, I always, at least in the Paraguayan context, always understood that as indicating African descent.
Mm.
And in your talk and in your research, you seem to indicate that you were interpreting that as anyone who was non-white. And so I just want to do you think that there's a regional difference there, or I guess just what you thought about that? Because again, I always, in fact, I would always see like interchanging going on between mulatto and bardo, and I always kind of understood because it kind of means brown, I guess, to some extent.
Okay, yeah.
And so I was just wondering what you're thinking with respect to the term pardo was.
Oh, definitely. And actually, this is an ongoing conversation I have even with Reed Andrews, who's the guy who wrote the Bible, right, of Afro-Argentines back in 1980. But yeah, so, and actually what it speaks to, Dr. Schuner, is how complex racial identity is and how geography plays a role. So just to add on, and this is where Reed would argue and still argues that Pardo means African descendant in Buenos Aires, right? I don't see that in Cordoba. What I do see is a transition. I see that, yes, it may have meant that in the colonial period, but when they go to the Republican period, especially in the census data, everybody is a Pardo. You're either a Pardo or you're a Blanco, which means white. Nobody is considered Spanish anymore. Spanish is a dirty word by then because, you got rid of them, so to speak, during the wars of independence. So you're either a Pardo or you are Blanco. And because I was meticulous and I traced these lives and I saw this continuously, whether they were mestizo or if they were mulatto or negro, they all become Pardo. And so I said that to me is showing me that this is why making sure that we have more than just Buenos Aires' story out there. because it's letting us see then a different level of browning, which ultimately is also part of the whitening process. So I do think regional and regional differences matter. And in this case, we're seeing how in just, well, today it would be about 8-hour drive, but how different that is. Also, you have a large indigenous population that remains very visible in the city, which I'm not finding in Buenos Aires. So that also plays a role in how things are, how racial identity is constructed over time. So I would say yes, for Cordoba during the colonial period, that yes, they were probably synonymous with mulattoes, but there is a clear break in Cordoba as it continues to maintain and hold on to their tradition, and as well as enter into this institutionalized whitening. So it goes from these various levels of what you could be to now you're either this or that. And that, in terms of Pardo, how do we make you at least seem or appear to be not only free, but also whitened?
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Yeah. It provides additional insight for the Paraguayan case even, I think. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
What's going on in the chat?
I just put a question in.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Brenda. Did you notice there were other areas in Argentina where the same process applied, or once you found the pot of gold, you stopped there?
B, once I found the pot of gold, I stopped there, period. It was too good to be true. I could not, I have so much material. Yeah, so for now, I'm still working my way through Cordoba. Like I said, I'm dealing with the woman who passed, but I also believe I found the first man that integrated the university, the first Black man in the entire country to integrate that to the University of Cordoba, which came to existence in 1613. And so, yeah, I'm still working my way, and it's a blessing and a curse. Right now it's a blessing because of the pandemic. All the archives are closed, so I can't get down there anyway. So I'm lucky to have taken a lot of information when I was there for about 2.5 years. And I'm just like, you know what, let me go and revisit this and see what I can do. So that's, yeah, I stopped.
Any other questions for Dr. Edwards?
Oh, there's one.
Yeah, Professor Sorata looks like he's got one here.
Oh, great. The Indian as part of the browning process you described made me think of the Dominican Republic,
Oh, yeah.
where the word indio is used in place of mulatto. Yet, some scholars see the case of the Dominican Republic as exceptional. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, no, I don't think they're exceptional then. And this is, again, one of the great things about moving beyond Buenos Aires is that we can now make these connections with other parts of Latin America and see that, okay, so Indio then is a very flexible term that can be used as another way to move towards whitening. And one in which possibly those that cannot phenotypically pass as white, right, can then possibly find another angle to become not Black, or ultimately, as the new catchphrase is, this level of anti-Blackness, right? I think that's important to stress. And this is something even I experienced. If we were to talk about my personal experiences in Argentina, and also Ecuador, where I lived for a little bit too, it was really interesting to see how I changed, how I changed differently. In Argentina, they never referred to me as negra, which was fine, which means black, but they would refuse to do it. I was either known as a mulata, which, you know, for us would be biracial, but between black and white, which I'm not. Or they would call me morocha, which is another othering term, which means dark person. And so anyone who is essentially has dark eyes and brown hair can be considered a morocho. When I went to Ecuador and I lived there for about 5 years, service learning, working in an orphanage, I then became a zamba. So that blew my mind, which zamba means that you are Black and indigenous, a mixture. And I was like, so, I mean, you can still see it even today and how there's this movement towards trying to affiliate and being polite that you are not Black, you're something else. So I would say, in terms of the Dominican Republic, that is really one of the ways that they're trying to move beyond being Black and, of course, being affiliated in any way, shape, or form with Haiti, which is considered to be the Black half of that island. And so, yeah, I think it still very much is perpetuating this notion of browning. But what I was doing with Argentina is at least showing that as another way or an avenue in which whitening was achieved.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards and Dr. Serrata for a great question. I know some of you have to leave, so feel free to leave if you have another appointment. Another opportunity here for a question for Dr. Edwards. Absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you for your time. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I think, Dr. Edwards, we've come to an end here. Thank you again for this wonderful talk. Very informative. Thank you for your patience. And on behalf of Grand Valley, we thank you.
Well, thank you again for this opportunity. It's great. I wasn't even able to rock my mug, the Grand Valley alumni mug that I dug out of somewhere, but I found it. Anyways, thanks again. It's great to be able to talk to so many of my former professors as well. I'm so happy to see some of my friends were able to make it. So thank you for this, for listening in, you guys. I really do appreciate it. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the training. I mean, come on, Dr. Stark, you know, it started with you, and yes, you were tough at times. And I'll stop there. No, I'm just joking. But no, no, you were, and you've become a trusted mentor as I've navigated through through graduate school, as well as the tenure process and this book. So I do want to thank you and highlight your mentorship as well as your friendship.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, everybody.
Oh, before we go, Professor Stark, there was some questions in the chat that said, how can we access the recording? I think we need to perhaps get clearance from Professor Edwards first, if we can make it publicly available. But that is a question out there, and that's something we can look into and getting up on the history website and maybe the Latin American Studies one as well.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine. Sure.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Yes.
Awesome.
All right, well, thank you everybody for attending. Please remember we have the Grand Rapids Latin American Film Festival that is going on now until October the 15th. And then on October the 29th, we have Dr. Delia Fernandez who's coming to talk. So thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye.